Montana Territory, 1881. The wind cut sharp through the Bitterroot Valley that morning, and Priscilla O'Connor stood barefoot in the frost, clutching the hand of her youngest child. Her eyes locked on the line of wagons waiting outside the trading post. She had nothing left. The townsfolk had already turned their backs when her husband died in a brawl 2 years ago. After that, the rumors came, fast whispers about where she came from, who her mother had been, why her children had different colored eyes. Then the fire last autumn took what little she had built. Her cabin collapsed in smoke and ash. She barely got the children out. Now even the land did not want her. "I cannot feed them," she whispered to the man behind the ledger, her voice cracking. "I have no dowry, no family, and nothing to trade." The man barely looked up. "You are looking to auction yourself?" Priscilla nodded, jaw clenched. Her son, Zachary, only 6, clung tighter to her skirt. Her daughter, Zoe, 8, stood behind them, her eyes too old for her face. The man scratched something on a paper. "Line up over there. The ranchers will pass through by noon." She stepped aside, pulling her shawl tighter, heart hammering. The sun rose higher, throwing gold across the valley. Men rode in one by one, their boots heavy on the dirt, eyes scanning the women like they were horses at market. Some women smiled. Others cried. Priscilla stood still. She had braided her hair. She had scrubbed the soot from her dress. But no man paused. Not until a tall figure rode in late, dust clinging to his coat, the brim of his hat low over his brow. He dismounted slow, his stride steady but not hurried. He looked like he did not care what the others were doing. His name was Fletcher Dorn. He was a rancher from the high ridges west of Hamilton, ran cattle alone since his brother died in the war. Folks called him strange, too quiet, too serious, but no one ever said a word to his face. He stepped past the first woman. Then the next. His eyes were sharp, unreadable. Then he stopped, right in front of her. Priscilla didn't move. The wind lifted a lock of her hair. The boy beside her coughed softly. Fletcher dropped to a knee. "These your children?" "Yes," she said. He looked at Zachary. Then Zoe. Then her. "You do this because you must or because you want to?" She met his gaze. "I do this because I will not let them starve." He stood again, taller than she'd thought. His voice was low but steady. "Then you are not for sale." The man with the ledger stepped forward. "That is not how this works, Dorn." She signed her name. Fletcher turned, slow and cold. "She is not for sale," he repeated. "She is mine." The silence dropped like a stone. Priscilla blinked. Her children looked up at him, unsure. Fletcher reached into his coat, pulled out a folded document. "Marriage license. Already signed. I filed it in Hamilton last week." The clerk hesitated. "You did not even know who she was." "I did not have to," Fletcher said. He looked at her again. "I knew I would find her." Something cracked in her chest. He held out his hand. "Come with me if you want to. I will not force you. But I will never let you be treated like livestock." Zachary looked up at her. "Mama!" Her fingers trembled as she reached out. They rode out of town that afternoon. No one stopped them. The cabin was 2 hours west, up into the pines. Smoke curled from a chimney. A dog barked once, then fell silent as they approached. "Why did you say I was yours?" she asked when they reached the porch. Fletcher dismounted, then helped her down, lifting Zachary into his arms like he weighed nothing. "Because I have been watching this trail for months, waiting for a woman who wouldn't look away when I spoke truth." She stepped onto the porch, Zoe clinging to her side. "I have nothing," she whispered. He opened the door. "You have your children. You have your name. And now you have this place." Inside it was warm. A fire crackled. There were quilts on the bed and stew already cooking. "Did you know I would come?" He shrugged. "Hoped." The days that followed were quiet, steady. Fletcher worked the land with sure hands, never asking more than she could give. He taught Zachary to feed the chickens, showed Zoe how to saddle a horse. He did not touch her, not at first. But every night, she saw the way his eyes followed her. Not with hunger, with something deeper. One evening, She found him mending a fence down by the pasture. "You never asked about my past," she said. He looked up. "You never asked about mine." She stepped closer. "Why do you not care what they say about me?" He leaned on the post, eyes soft. "Because I see how your daughter watches you. Because your boy sleeps through the night now. Because you put your hand on the stove to make sure it is warm before you cook." She swallowed hard. "You think I do not see what it takes to survive out here?" he said. "You never gave up. That is all I need to know." The sun dipped behind the hills. She laid her hand on his arm. "I want to stay." Fletcher nodded once. "Then stay." It was not a kiss, not yet. But it was the beginning of something quiet and strong. And for the first time in years, Priscilla O'Connor did not feel like a woman waiting to be thrown away. She felt claimed. And she was not afraid. The first hard snow came early that year, folding over the ridges in a thick silence. Fletcher had told her the wind shifted fast in these parts. But Priscilla hadn't expected it to settle so deep and so soon. She watched it from the porch with Zoe wrapped in a woolen shawl beside her, the girl tracing the frost with her fingertip along the post. Inside, Zachary was asleep in the crook of the hearth, a carved wooden pony tucked under his arm. Fletcher had whittled it 2 nights ago after supper, his hands sure and unhurried as he worked by lamplight, saying nothing, offering it only when the boy had begun to nod off. He carved the name Z into the underside, rough but careful. That morning, Fletcher had gone down to the lower pasture to check if the calves had found shelter. He hadn't taken the horse. Said it was better to walk in deep snow, less chance of a break. He hadn't come back yet. Zoe looked up at her. "Will he be all right?" Priscilla tightened the shawl around her. "He knows this land like the back of his hand." "Did he ever have children?" Zoe asked, voice small. Priscilla hesitated. "No, then how does he know what to do with us?" She looked down at her daughter. "Some people don't need practice to be kind." Zoe turned that over in her mind for a while. Then she said, "I think he listens harder than most." Priscilla didn't answer. She was already watching the ridge where the pines broke, heart tightening at every shadow. He returned just past dusk, shoulders crusted with snow, his left glove missing. He handed it to her without a word when she opened the door for him, wet and torn halfway through at the palm. "Barbed wire?" she asked. "Old gate latch. Slipped." He sat on the bench near the fire, steam rising from his coat. She set the kettle on, then knelt in front of him, lifting his hand to see the gash. It wasn't deep, but it bled steady. She dipped a cloth in warm water and cleaned it without speaking. He didn't flinch. "You should have let me come," she said after a while. "You had the children. I could have walked with you. Or waited up the trail." He met her gaze, quiet. "You've had enough men leave you behind. I won't be one of them." She looked down, wrapping his hand with a strip of linen. The heat from his skin seeped through her fingers. When she stood, he caught her wrist. "I'd like to teach you to ride before the thaw." She blinked. "Why?" "I have a second saddle. And it's a long way to town if you ever need to send word." She nodded once. "All right." That night, after the children were down, she sat at the table sewing a patch on Zachary's coat. Fletcher was near the window mending a strap on a snowshoe. The oil lamp flickered between them. He didn't look up when he spoke. "You ever grow corn?" She glanced over. "My father tried. Back east. Too much rock in the soil. I've got a patch seeded from last year. Needs turning come spring. Thought you might want it." "For what?" He tied off the strap. "To plant what you like. Beans. Squash. Herbs." She folded her hands in her lap. "No one's offered me land before." He finally looked at her. "I'm not offering it. It's yours already." She didn't answer, just watched him a long moment until the lamplight caught the faintest edge of warmth in his eyes. The next day she woke before the sun. The stove had burned low and the windows held frost patterns like pressed lace. She stepped outside with the pail, boots crunching through snow toward the well. The air was brittle, but the sky was clear. At the edge of the tree line, Fletcher was splitting kindling. He paused, then nodded toward the smoke curling from the chimney. "House kept warm." She nodded. Zoe didn't even stir. He leaned on the axe handle, watching her. You don't talk much about your own people. They weren't the kind that stayed, she said. You ever want to find them again? She shook her head. I used to. Now I think I was meant to come west. He let that settle, then said my mother was half Mandan. Never talked about it. Said it wasn't safe. Priscilla looked up. Is that why you live so far off? He considered that. Partly. Also quieter out here. She stepped closer, the pail swinging from her hand. You think people can start over? Only way most of us make it. She reached out, brushing a curl of sawdust from his sleeve. His eyes didn't leave hers. The wind stirred through the trees behind them, and he didn't move. I think I'd like to stay, she said. You already are. She didn't know who leaned in first, but his hand came to her cheek, rough with cold, and her breath caught. The kiss was slow, like something long held back but certain in its landing. When they parted, she didn't step away. Neither did he. By late January, the snow had hardened into glass along the north slope, and the creek behind the barn froze in a long, silent ribbon. Fletcher showed Priscilla how to scatter ash over the yard path so Zoe wouldn't slip on her way to the henhouse. Zachary had taken to following the dog around the property, mimicking Fletcher's gait with a child's solemn determination. The house settled into its quiet rhythm, and with it, a kind of trust began to take shape between her and the man who'd claimed her without ever making demands. It was in the way he handed her the last biscuit at breakfast without looking up, or how he paused when passing her in the kitchen, his hand brushing the edge of her sleeve with a hesitation that felt more like reverence than chance. That morning she found him in the lean-to sharpening his blade, sleeves pushed to the elbow. A pot of lard sat near the door, half frozen. She leaned against the wall, arms crossed. You ever think about building something more permanent? She asked. He looked up from the whetstone. House? She nodded. This place is solid, but it's not meant for four. He set the blade aside. You thinking of leaving the loft? I'm thinking of a room with a door, she said. For the children first. Then maybe one for us. Fletcher stood, brushing sawdust from his trousers. I've got cedar curing near the ridge. Meant for a tack shed, but we could frame out a second room. You'd change your plan for that? I didn't have a reason for the shed until now. She didn't smile, just met his gaze, steady and quiet. That afternoon, they walked the ridge together while the children napped beneath quilts. Fletcher carried an axe over his shoulder, and she carried the measuring rope, her boots sinking into the soft crust of snow. The wind was gentler up high, the kind that whispered in the pines instead of cutting through skin. He showed her the cedar stacks, bark flaking beneath the ice, and she ran a hand over one of the split logs. This land's been in your family long? She asked. My father trapped here before the war. Dug the first well with his own hands. After he died, my brother and I tried to keep it together. Your brother, was he older? By 3 years. Took the newspaper job in Missoula when the war ended. Thought he'd stay safe. Got sick instead. She lowered her hand from the log. You never went? I was 17 when they came through Hamilton. Too young to enlist. By the time I was old enough, it was already near over. Would you have gone? I think about that more than I should. They stood in silence, the hush between them not empty but full in a way that felt like breath held together. She crouched to mark the ground with the end of the rope. This be enough for 2 small rooms. I'll start clearing tomorrow. When they returned to the cabin, Zachary was seated at the table with an open book. Zoe was beside him, helping him sound out the words under her breath. Priscilla paused at the door, watching them. You know the man in the general store with the crooked eye? She asked later as she ladled stew into bowls. Fletcher nodded from where he sat carving a new latch. Tom Sutter. He offered to buy Zoe's boots last fall. Told me I'd no use for them come spring. He looked up still. You tell him no? I told him I'd trade them for a pair twice her size and a sack of oats. He settled the blade down. What did he say to that? Didn't say anything. But he didn't ask again. He leaned back slightly, elbows on his knees. You don't let people take things from you. I've had enough taken already. He nodded once. You want to teach the girl to read maps? She's already asking about the rail lines. I've got an old surveyor's chart in the chest. It's hers. That night, She stood behind him as he washed at the basin. His shoulders were broad, marked by a long, pale scar beneath the skin near the left blade. She reached out and touched it. He turned, water dripping from his hands. Old break. Fell from a tree cutting line for fence. Do you still feel it? When the ear shifts. She stepped closer. I feel mine too. Just not in the bone. His hand came to her waist, slow and sure. You don't have to say anything you don't want. I want to say this, she said. I don't know how to be someone's comfort. I only know how to survive. He rested his forehead against hers. Then survive with me. She kissed him, quiet and certain. There was no urgency to it, no sudden heat. Just the steady grounding of two people who'd gone too long without softness. Later, when they lay together, the wind pressing faint against the walls, she rested her head on his chest and listened to the rhythm of a life she hadn't thought she'd find. Not in the wild. Not with a man who saw her as anything more than a burden. She closed her eyes, her hand folded in his. And for the first time in years, sleep came without fear. By early March, the snow began to rot at the edges, turning the yard to mud and waking the earth beneath. Fletcher had taken to checking the low beams of the barn each morning for thaw drips, his coat damp from the melt that came faster by the day. The cedar logs for the addition were still stacked behind the house, but the ground was too soft to dig a foundation. Until it dried, they waited. One afternoon, while Zachary napped and Zoe sorted seed packets by the stove, Priscilla found Fletcher on the south slope, kneeling beside a crooked fence post that had heaved from the frost. He was setting a stone under its base, hands bare, fingers red from the cold soil. I can hold it steady, she said, crouching beside him. He glanced up, then nodded once. Need the line to run straight through to the creek bend. If I leave it loose now, the whole fence lean by midsummer. She pressed her palms to the post, anchoring it as he packed earth around the base. You always fix things before they break? He tamped the soil with the back of the spade. Try to. I used to wait until it was too late. Thought that was just how it had to be. You don't have to live like that anymore. She didn't answer, just leaned her weight into the post until it held firm. That evening, as twilight stretched long across the hills, a rider came up the trail, a man in a blue wool coat with a rifle strapped to his saddle and a limp that showed when he dismounted. Fletcher stepped down from the porch, eyes narrowed. Priscilla watched from the doorway, one hand resting against the jamb. Name's Harlan Ash, the man said. Came from Deer Lodge. Looking for a Fletcher Dorn. Fletcher didn't move. You found him. The man took off his hat, thumbed the brim. Heard you've got extra hands now. Couple of folks in town said you married. Fletcher stepped forward. What's your business? Looking for work. I ran a line crew before the snows came. My horse went lame, and I've been sleeping in the feed barn at Everett's place since New Year. Fletcher looked him over. You any good with a saw? Better with a draw knife. I used to shape beams for the rail company. Priscilla stepped outside then, her shawl drawn close. We don't need trouble. Harlan met her eyes. Ma'am, I've had my share of that. I'm just trying to finish the winter with my boots on. Fletcher turned to her. If we want that addition up by planting season, I'll need another pair of hands. She nodded once. He can stay in the tack room. Fletcher spoke without looking back at the man. You'll work sunup to sundown, and if you cross a line, you'll leave the same day. Harlan nodded. Fair enough. They set him to hauling stone the next morning. He didn't complain, didn't linger near the house. When Zachary wandered toward the barn that afternoon, Harlan pointed him back toward the steps with a quiet word and a nod. That night, Priscilla and Fletcher stood in the field behind the cabin, measuring out the corner stakes by lamplight. The moon hung low, pale and wide above the ridge. He's not like the others, she said. No, Fletcher replied. But I'll keep him close until we know. She adjusted the stake in her hand. You always this careful? Only since people started depending on me. She turned to him, the chill rising through the damp grass. You didn't have to take us in. He met her gaze. You didn't have to stay. She stepped closer. I don't regret it. His voice was low. Neither do I. She touched his chest then, just above the place his shirt opened at the collar. When the house is finished, I want to sleep in a bed beside you. Not just now and then. Every night. His hand came to rest over hers. Then I'll build it strong enough to last. They didn't kiss under the moon. They didn't need to. The promise hung between them, simple and steady as the rising frame of a home. Inside, Zoe was reading by lamplight, her braid trailing over her shoulder. Zachary lay curled on the rug, one arm around the dog. The fire popped, low and warm. Priscilla stood at the threshold and knew, without needing to speak it, that this was no longer a place they were passing through. It was theirs. All of it. The frost lifted from the fields by mid-April, leaving behind furrows of dark, ready earth. Fletcher and Harlan raised the wall frames in the first week of sun, and by the second the roof beams were set. Priscilla kept the children near the house while the hammering echoed through the hills. She let Zachary help her press seeds into the garden beds and watched Zoe kneel beside the rows, whispering questions about root depth and weather signs. One evening, just after the last plank had been nailed into place, Fletcher stepped into the half-built room with dirt still clinging to his boots. Priscilla followed him in, the scent of fresh cut wood lingering thick in the air. "Floor's still rough," he said, running a hand along the sill. "But it's sound." She looked around the space. "It'll hold our bed?" He met her gaze. "It'll hold everything we need." She touched the frame where the door would hang and drew in a breath. "I used to think I wasn't meant for a home like this." His voice was quiet. "What changed your mind?" She turned to face him. "You." He stepped forward, close enough that she could feel the warmth off his skin. "You didn't need me to build it. I needed someone who wouldn't tear it down." They stood in the unfinished room until the light faded behind the ridge. When they walked back toward the house together, she slipped her fingers through his and let them stay there. The next week, Fletcher rode into Hamilton with Harlan to fetch window glass and hinges. Priscilla stayed behind, and for the first time, she didn't feel the unease she'd known in every place before. She swept the cabin, baked bread, and mended the collar of Fletcher's second shirtwork that once felt like survival, now done with an ease she'd never thought would belong to her. That evening, when the men returned, Zoe ran out first, calling down the trail. Harlan passed her a bundle of nails wrapped in cloth, then headed toward the barn without a word. Fletcher dismounted slower, his eyes finding Priscilla where she stood on the porch. Zachary balanced on her hip. "I brought something," he said, lifting a sack from the saddle. She tilted her head. "What is it?" He set it down and pulled out a bolt of soft, pale muslin. "Thought you might want curtains. For the new room." She stared at the fabric, then up at him. "You remembered I said I missed the sound of them." He nodded. "Figured I'd give them back to you." That night, after the children were asleep and the yard had gone quiet, Priscilla stepped into the new room alone. The moonlight fell across the boards in silver lines. Fletcher followed her moments later, carrying the quilt from the foot of their loft bed. "I want to sleep here tonight," she said. He unfolded the quilt and laid it over the straw mattress they dragged in that morning. "Then we will." They lay down side by side, not speaking, hands touching between them. She turned toward him in the dark, her voice low. "There were days I thought I'd never feel safe again." "Not really." He brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. "And now?" She laid her palm over his chest. "Now I know what peace feels like." He kissed her then, slow and sure, and the room held their breath, the walls not yet painted, the door not yet hung, but it was theirs. And it was enough. By late spring, the garden bloomed in rows of green. The hens laid steady, and the children ran barefoot across the field. Harlan stayed through planting, then rode on without asking for anything more than a warm meal and a place to sleep while the ground softened. Fletcher gave him a pair of dry boots and a firm handshake. "They'll always have a place with you, won't they?" Harlan asked as he swung into the saddle. "They are my home," Fletcher said. When June came, Priscilla stood barefoot in the doorway of their finished room, a linen curtain fluttering behind her. She watched Fletcher walk back from the pasture, the sun high on his shoulders, and felt no fear rise in her chest, only the calm of a life she had built with her own hands, beside a man who had never once asked her to be anything but exactly who she was. That night, they sat on the porch with the children asleep inside. The stars spilled quiet across the sky, and the air was warm enough that she leaned into him without needing a shawl. There's wild mint near the creek, he said. I was thinking we could dry some for tea. I was thinking we should build another shelf inside, she replied. We're running out of space for jars. He took her hand, laced his fingers with hers. Then we'll build one. They didn't speak for a while after that. They didn't need to. Years passed and the house stood through every season, through snow and rain and sun-warmed days that never seemed to end. Zoe grew taller and learned to read names on railroad maps. Zachary could saddle a horse by the time he was 10. The quilt on the bed wore thin at the corners, and Priscilla mended it with care, just as she had mended her own life piece by piece. And through it all, Fletcher loved her with the same quiet strength he had carried from the beginning, never with grand words, only with the steadfast truth of his presence. Together, they grew old in the rhythm of that land. And not once did either of them ever doubt that they had found exactly where they were meant to be. Theirs was not a story of rescue, nor one of escape. It was a story of arrival of two people who had come through the hardest parts of life and found, in each other, not just shelter, but belonging. And when the wind moved through the tall grass each spring, it carried the sound of their laughter, steady and full, across the hills.